Hello and welcome. I'm Jenny Hall. Thanks for joining me for another card making tutorial. Today I'm adding heat embossed wood elements, just tiny pieces of wood that I've added some heat embossing to create something special on a card. I'm stamping with Flowering Desert stamp set together with a panel of watercolor paper and an Aqua painter. The color palette includes some greens, blue-greens, and purple. To make the image look like it's a bit more watercolored, I'm going to stamp it on a piece or a scrap of watercolor paper. And this is on the bumpy side of the paper. There's usually a bumpy side and a smooth side. This brush is filled just with tap water, so there's nothing special. Just move the tip of the brush over the image that is stamped, and the color moves around enough to where it looks like it's been watercolored straight from the brush. It's really cool. It's kind of like magic. Now here is a larger piece of cactus that it looks like the image didn't get completely inked up, but that's okay. We're going to demonstrate how that can work for us. I stamped off in order to get a lighter shade of green. And this has a bit of a cactus builder in the Flowering Desert stamp set. So here's a couple of ways to use that bigger and smaller cactus image to kind of make what looks like a cactus in your own eye. Just like before, we're going to move the ink around on that watercolor paper, and it leaves a bit of like a highlight where the image did not stamp down. So just because it didn't give you a really good coverage, that's quite all right. We can still work with it. So let's create some contours to this piece of cactus. This is one shade darker of ink. This is Pear Pizzazz, and I'm adding it just to the left side of the image. This is going to create a contour that looks really natural. Now let's go even one shade darker. This is Tranquil Tide, and it's just along the left-hand edge. And just like magic, our images appear to be a bit more three-dimensional and look a bit more watercolored and lifelike. Isn't it cool how just mixing a few colors in the right places can do something special in this way? So try this out on all the different little cactus images and see what you can get as far as some kind of shadows, highlights, and lowlights, all different ways. To fill in the background, I'm going to use Highland Heather, which is a really light purple color. I'll be doing the wet on wet watercolor technique. That means that I'm going to run the brush over the background area that will be colored. Don't squeeze the barrel, just run the brush. The friction will take some water out on its own. And then when I drop the color in, the water that's already on the paper will spread the color and give it a very natural, soft, and subtle look. Even if there are some brush strokes, it's easy to even them out and still make this look very natural. It is watercolored, and so we want there to be a watercolor look, but just being careful not to have any very harsh lines. The wet on wet watercolor technique is perfect for this type of method. Now I want to create some shadows underneath each of these plants. This is supposed to be a desert, and I imagine that it is moonlight. So there will be a natural shadow, plus it helps the images to look like they belong on a certain place if they're a bit grounded. So using the same ink but less diluted, underneath where the shadows would lie, I've just added a little bit of a drop line. Very simple. If you would like to go even further with your cactus, then there's a stamp in the Flowering Desert stamp set that will add the little cactus needles. I've stamped these in black as soon as the watercolor paper is dry, because I want that part to be crisp. Here is how the large cactus is colored. Now keep in mind you can use any color combinations that you like. I'm just giving you some tips on the colors that I've chosen to use for this project. I stamped off and am using a second generation of ink, that's Lemon Lime Twist, adding in a 1 shade darker of Pear Pizzazz, and coloring just like the previous images, which means the darker color is on the left hand side of the cactus image. Because the arms of the cactus are going to appear as if they're not somebody's arm that is a part of their torso, then I want to make sure that I give it a bit of a separation where the arm would kind of be coming from the backside of the main branch of cactus. I hope that makes sense. Just have fun with it and see what you can come up with. I'm stamping the sentiment for the front of the card on a piece of Gray Granite cardstock, and this will be heat embossed with white embossing powder. I find it handy to keep an old paintbrush where I keep my stamp supplies, and that can brush off any excess powder. The white would show up especially. Now here's what this card looks like as I put it together, and I'm really not happy with it. I don't like the empty space that came out with the die cuts at all, so I'm going to attempt to do some repairs and add some more images. However, you've probably already guessed that this is not enough to help this project. The layout design is good, it's just that panel did not die cut the way that I think it would look good. So I've tried to add another stamp, and then I'm also adding some flick marks with a marker, and nothing could save it. I just really was not happy with it. So I repainted the panel. I stepped away for a day and got a clear mind and thought I would come back to this because I didn't like to leave it the way it was. So I've used the exact same methods, and now I'm going to add these pretty little butterfly elements that are a free item you can choose from the Celebration brochure. To create the metallic look of the elements, I'm taking the little wood pieces and putting the Versamark directly on the wood pieces, just like we would stamping a sentiment. There's no difference. The clear sticky ink from the Versamark pad will stick to the side of the element that we touched to the stamp pad, and it's going to hold the embossing powder. This is not much different from using embossing on paper. Once we have that clear sticky ink in place, then I'm adding silver embossing powder. And once I've got the powder on them, I can shake off the excess powder and move them over to some sort of a safe surface. I'll move them again over to it's an old cutting board, and that's going to protect my work surface from the heat. But I don't want any of that paper to get the heat embossing on it or any of my cutting board, so I'm using this little scrap of paper. I have my finger protected with a paper piercing tool to actually take the brunt of the heat. By doing it this way, I didn't get any heat onto my fingers, and there was not a place on the element that it showed that the little tool was taking away from any of the embossed powder. Not at all. This worked really well. So now I have my brand new watercolor panel. I'm going to attach it to a card base with snail adhesive. I chose to go with a different shape this time, so I used the rectangle stitched dies. The circle looked good, but it didn't hold all the images the way I wanted them to. This is just something fresh. I needed to start over again completely, and this layout worked for me a little better. I've taken the sentiment off the other card and trimmed it down, and I will attach these little wooden pieces with mini glue dots. I found that the mini glue dots help them to stay in place, and they really don't want to move around at all. Liquid glue would work as well, but it would kind of gush out on the sides. Mini glue dots are much more easy for me to control the adhesive. So once they're put in place, then the sentiment will just go over them. I'll put a few Stampin' Dimensionals on the back side of the sentiment to where it lays over these wooden elements. I really like adding these wooden elements to my project because they just look really fun, and I had a good time embossing them. It's something different. It's not something that I do all the time, and it just kind of gave my project a little bit of a fun look. For the inside of the card, I'm using a layer of Tranquil Tide cardstock with my Whisper White cardstock, and I'm attaching that with a small amount of liquid glue. I wanted to add one of the other sentiments from the stamp set to the inside that says "You're so awesome." I really like the idea of sending this sentiment on a card to a friend. I'm using Pear Pizzazz to use a different image on the inside of the card, and the inside of the card I feel is just as nice as the front. Here are two cards together, and I hope you can see that the left side is much more pleasing than the right. The right hand card was not wrong, it just didn't make me happy. And part of art is that I feel like I need it to make me happy. Thank you so much for joining me for this tutorial. All of the products that I have used along with the measurements are listed in the video description. Sometimes it's a bit irritating when a card making project goes wrong, but it's always nice to know that we can still make something out of it. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you next time.
Hi, my name is Trip. Thanks for watching the video. See you next time.